Hello and welcome to today's mini lecture on rigor within qualitative research. Given the subjective nature of qualitative methods, researchers have developed different ways in which rigor can be applied to research. The aim of rigor and quality in a qualitative inquiry is to evaluate the argument that the inquiry's findings are worth paying attention to. This is quite different from the conventional experimental, i.e. quantitative precedent of attempting to show validity, soundness, and significance. And qualitative researchers don't always agree on how to judge the credibility of a qualitative study. There are multiple views on how best to demonstrate this credibility, rigor, and quality. Some people take a translational approach where they translate the traditional quantitative markers into qualitative ones, such as looking at validity, reliability, generalizability, and objectivity, while others suggest that the ways to judge credibility of the study based on inherently qualitative issues are what is more important. And then there are those that who suggest that creating any universal standards for qualitative research credibility is just too reductive and limiting. However, as Tracy states, criteria for quality are important because they serve as shorthand about the core values of a certain craft. Today we're going to be looking at two models of both, so both these sort of translational and then the transformative ideas of rigor. And I should say that there's many more approaches to doing rigor within qualitative research. And then, if you're doing a qualitative study, you can use any one of these approaches. However, you just want to be really clear throughout the design and then finally the reporting which one you're utilizing and how it fits with your chosen methodology. We're going to start today with Lincoln and Guba's work. In their 1985 text, Naturalistic Inquiry, they set up standards to judge qualitative rigor and the validity and overall quality. Their model is frequently cited and is one of the frameworks which most translates into a quantitative pattern of thought. And what they termed their framework was trustworthiness. So trustworthiness defined by Lincoln and Guba is judged on four criteria: credibility, so this is in preference to internal validity; transferability, in preference to external validity and generalizability; dependability, in preference to reliability; and confirmability, in preference to objectivity. So as the term trustworthiness sounds, it's just basically, can you judge and can you evaluate if you can trust this study, if you can trust the researcher who's developed it? Does it have trustworthiness for you as the reader? One of the key criteria addressed by quantitative research is that of internal validity, in which one seeks to ensure that their study measures or tests what is actually intended. According to Lincoln and Guba, the qualitative investigator's equivalent concept is credibility, which deals with the question of how congruent are the findings with reality. Lincoln and Guba argue that ensuring credibility is one of the most important factors in establishing trustworthiness. The credibility criteria involves establishing that the results of qualitative research are credible or believable from the perspective of the participant in the research, and that you have a menu of options available to you to achieve this credibility. You're not required to use all of the approaches, and there are many more not mentioned here, but you should at least be applying some of these approaches to establish the quality of your evaluation. So prolonged engagement is basically having multiple points of contact with your participants. So it's always great to be able to have a really long time in the field, but it's frequently difficult. So if you're trying to manage time constraints, it might be that you have multiple points of contact, from emails to field notes, telephone conversations, short interactions before and after you do your interviews. Referential adequacy is a method used to store raw data and records to examine later and compare to other future studies that show the credibility of the data. Triangulation is something that you've heard many times, and in qualitative research we try to examine a few phenomenon we are studying from multiple angles in an attempt to ensure that we have the best possible understanding of this. We can do this by mixing methods, using multiple data collection techniques, and using various sources of information, so different types of participants. This is also different than the idea of theoretical triangulation, which we'll also discuss. Then there's peer debriefing, and this relates to having colleagues or a team of evaluators that you bounce ideas off of. You basically are checking your interpretation and your thinking and your process of analysis. In many cases, your peer debriefers kind of act as almost a devil's advocate, and they try to poke holes and find fault within your research. Basically, they're trying to ask and ascertain, are your findings reasonable and plausible to others? The negative case analysis idea is this idea that data may indicate that there are different patterns for different groups of participants, or that there's something different in a certain case. And so although qualitative research is frequently concerned with finding patterns or themes to make sense of a phenomenon, there are cases that you're going to find competing patterns which do not fit, and these are known as negative cases. So this may indicate what the pattern differs for different groups of participants, but that you want to be able to find these and evaluate them and compare and contrast within your own theme development. So for example, if you're evaluating how patients have dealt with a HIV positive diagnosis, you may find that patients generally have a negative experience with fear for their future. However, you might come across a patient who takes a positive stance, using the experience as an opportunity to reevaluate their lives. And so what you want to be able to do is examine these negative cases to provide insights that you might not have conceived of before. And finally, member checking, which we've talked about frequently. And this just refers to sending back the transcriptions, the raw data to your participants and asking if you have transcribed things correctly. Oftentimes, participants might actually read what they've written and they might clarify or expand or provide more input. But you can also do a type of member checking where you have done your analysis and you send back your initial findings, and they'll talk to you about if that feels accurate to them or not. So when we think about transferability, this is where we're really getting down to this idea of sampling. Of course, in qualitative research, we don't seek to have a representative sample, which might be difficult anyway if we think about the populations that we're interested in. And this is actually quite difficult for quantitative researchers as well. So there isn't a one identified population of, say, sex workers or students that have chronic anxiety. So we're always kind of guessing at our sampling frame. So in qualitative research, we acknowledge that we're not going to be able to have a representative sample, but we do want our data to have applicability beyond the context in which we've conducted the research. Therefore, we try to employ a concept of transferability. And this is the idea that we're going to be using thick and rich descriptions to allow our clients to be, our readers to be able to make judgments of how applicable the findings are in a different context. This approach is similar to the idea in experimental designs that you describe enough detail so that the study could be replicated and results tested. And so the way we do this, we provide thick, rich descriptions not only of the participants' voices, which is quite important because we want to be sure that we're representing them to the fullest, and this involves providing direct quotes. However, you also want to be able to give a thick and rich description of the context and culture in which you're creating the research. And finally, similar to the idea of replication logic, you want to be able to describe your research methodology, and its application must be described in the research clearly so that people understand what you've done. So as a researcher, you also need to establish dependability and confirmability. And this is basically what will provide the proof that allows your readers and reviewers the proof that they can assess whether or not they trust you as a researcher and the work that you have done. So oftentimes we use an audit trail in qualitative research, and this is basically the similar idea to taxes, where we keep enough receipts and things like that so that if we get audited, we can prove that we haven't been basically cooking the books. So providing an audit trail can consist of having your raw data, so keeping all of your observation notes, your transcripts, your memos, all of these things. You maintain your data reconstruction and synthesis products. So this is just basically the proof of your analytic and interpretive process, which would be your code book, the definitions, themes, theme definitions, and analytic memos. Actually, your memos are the process notes. So these are the memos about why you might have been taking certain actions or thinking about how you were interpreting the data. And then also you want to provide any materials relating to your intentions. And this is basically like a research diary or reflexivity log. And it can just include anything about you, the background that you have, their specialization, your social location, anything that gives you, the reader, an opportunity to understand who you are as the researcher. So as you can see in this assessment criteria chart that basically outlines the Lincoln and Guba trustworthiness, if we're thinking about internal validity and we really want to know how we measured what we set out to measure, then in qualitative we're going to be looking at credibility. If we're really thinking about validity and generalizability, the question is how applicable are results to other subjects, participants in other contexts, which leads us to transferability. When we think about reliability, we're looking at consistency within how we've conducted the research and if it would be replicated, which again is dependability. And then finally, if we think about the idea of objectivity, the issue here is neutrality. And so the question is, to what extent are our findings affected by our personal interests and biases, which then is shown through in confirmability. So as you can probably tell, the Lincoln and Guba model is really sort of based on this idea of what rigor looked like before qualitative research got off the ground. And you can tell when I talk about being a translational model how it translates from quantitative ideas into qualitative research. We then have the transformative models, which are people who've come along and said that we can't do the same kind of criteria and evaluations, and we need to have our own evaluation of criteria of rigor specific to qualitative research. And this led to Tracy, who is one person that many people cite when they're talking about rigor and trustworthiness. And she created the Big Tent model, which is 8 interlocking indicators of quality. And these are flexible and they depend on your goals, which one that you might use. So you just need to be sure that you're using some. And the 8 are worthy topic, rich rigor, sincerity, credibility, resonance, significant contribution, and that they're ethical and coherent. So the first is a worthy topic, and any good research needs to be relevant, timely, and evocative. Topics should reveal an aspect of life that is overlooked or underexplored. We can also consider approaching a project that might seem counterintuitive, meaning it challenges well-accepted standards or knowledge, possibly from a new theory or lens. And often worthy research can evoke transformation or emotion in the reader and discover surprises within phenomenon. A characteristic of research carried out in an appropriate and disciplined manner that is clearly rich in rigor is where the researcher has collected enough data, spent enough time in the field, the theoretical goals are well aligned with the sample, and the appropriate methodological procedures are followed. If you remember back to the first lecture that you watched where there was the chart where there was the methodological inconsistencies, you need to be able to look across the table and make sure that you're following all of the appropriate sort of fits for your methodology and theories and that they're all aligned. This means if you're doing a grounded theory, you specify which grounded theory and you follow the steps as outlined, including theoretical sampling, constant comparative analysis, and saturation. If you're, say, doing a grounded theory and you're not going to follow those guidelines, then you have to have a very clear and rich description of why you're not going to follow those. Good research is also genuine and vulnerable, and this is one reason I continue to challenge you to be aware of and talk about your positionality and subjectivity. A good study should feel sincere, and this can be felt in the form of the researcher's self-reflection about the processes, biases, and other reaction to you. A good study is also transparent and honest about how the research transpired. The credibility of a study is most of all judged by the trustworthiness, plausibility, and good character of the study, which is achieved through thick description. This is, again, where you're going to explicate the cultural specifics in less detail, you tap into tacit knowledge, you take time and you have experience in the context, and you examine not only what was said and done, but you examine the absences of talk and activity. You want to utilize either triangulation or crystallization. These are two practices that differ in paradigmatic motivation but are aligned in purpose. With triangulation, this is developed out of more of a realist paradigm, and it's the belief that one could get into a single view of reality. Therefore, it's focused on the convergence through multiple points of view, either from two or more sources of data, theoretical frameworks, or researchers' interpretations, and this is what helps make data more credible. Crystallization, though, is motivated by the post-scholars and assumes a prismatic view of reality. and that what we see depends on our position. Multiple points makes data multifaceted and creates a complex picture. In your studies, you can pick between crystallization and triangulation, not both, as one is to come to a convergent view and the other is to come to a more complex and partial understanding of the phenomenon. You also want to engage in multivocality, meaning you use a variety of participants' points of view to highlight agreement and disagreement, while also attending to how your subjectivity changes in the field, all to consider in your analysis how these differences play a role in emergent findings. Tracy also talks about the need to engage in member reflections, which is closely aligned with the idea of member checking, where you share in-process conclusions with participants, ask for feedback, make note of their reactions, and include reactions in future analyses. So as you can see, much of the credibility aspect of Tracy's framework is similar to Trustworthiness from Lincoln and Guba. However, it does take a bit of a different view because this is only one aspect of the study of rigor within qualitative research. The question is then, if we're reading and we're reading a qualitative researcher's article, we're probably not going to have all of the background information on if they've done a credible study. However, the goal is that through doing incredible work at the outset, what we're going to read, the text is going to reverberate with us as readers, and this is considered resonance. The first goal as the qualitative author of a paper is to describe and write your findings evocatively. The writing of the text is intertwined with the findings. If we're talking about a person's lived experience, we should be able to feel them as we read about them. And this can be achieved through good writing, and many qualitative writers actually take courses in creative writing to assist in developing their abilities as research writers. Part of evocative writing is also to utilize particularly revealing cases and presenting quotes to the readers. So if we look at a recent quote, I just was completing a project on how Latinx teenagers felt about viewing the border separations of families at the US-Mexico border. And so I could have used this quote. I sympathize towards children and adults who have been affected. This isn't particularly evocative, and it doesn't really tell us anything different than a lot of people who watch the news saw, whether they were Latino or not, or adolescents or not. So instead I included the phrase, it tears my heart to see them being separated, and I can't imagine the fact if I were to be separated from my parents, it would be like a part of me has gone forever. And this evokes so much more of the pain and fear that our participants were describing in this study, because they felt because they were Latino, they could really share in that fate and really understand what it might be like to be separated from their parents. The second aspect of resonance is naturalistic generalization. And this is just basically where you provide readers with a vicarious experience of the data. So whereas in the previous quote, we're just evoking the feeling, through naturalistic generalizations, we're trying to have the reader feel those feelings vicariously, which can assist the reader to develop a personal, intuitive understanding of the phenomenon. And this is closely related to transferable findings. So this is opposed to the idea of generalizability. But instead we're seeking to develop a local and contextually situated knowledge. Transferability then in research transfers into one's own action or experience of a similar phenomenon. So if we think back to the previous quote, while it was a Latino adolescent, they were talking about border separations and how it caused them to imagine being separated from their parents. I might read this and feel the emotion, and I might understand the phenomenon as someone who currently is feeling separated from my family because of COVID and the fear that I might not be able to see them again if they get sick, and therefore feel like my participant, a part of me has gone forever. So therefore, with the transferability, it was within the feelings and me being able to vicariously experience it. And so oftentimes this means that findings must correspond to something significant for it to touch on another person. Moving on to significant contribution, we do need to ask if our research extends, transforms, complicates a body of knowledge. If you think back to the week we looked at grounded theory, when I asked you about the theory of one paper, did it actually extend our knowledge? That's why I asked this. In my view, all of the theory developed did was give a basic and accepted view of relationships. Instead, our work must have the ability to build theory for unique understandings or hold practical significance in the development of useful knowledge. It might also have a heuristic significance, which moves people forward in their thinking and curiosity to be a catalyst for new discoveries. And the work might also be methodologically significant by explicating a new methodological approach to research. So in some way, you need to be able to discuss how your work is significant and in what domain. And of course, above all, for a study to be credible, it must first be ethical. As we discussed in the beginning of this semester, ethics should move beyond simple procedural ethics such as IRB. And while IRB standards are important, they are a low bar that can be in place more to protect you and the university than the participants. So I do encourage you to consider the situational ethics which will emerge in specific societies, cultures, and contexts, as well as your relational ethics, where you become deeply reflective of the effect you have in the lives of your participants, which is often related to the idea of the feminist ethic of care. It includes the idea of ethics of exiting to understand how you write into being a knowledge of another person and how we can easily exploit our participants. And finally, we get to the last of Tracy's 8 criteria, which is found in what she calls meaningful coherence. This is where research should achieve the stated purpose and accomplish what it claims to be about. This could be viewed as similar to discriminate validity. It's connected back to using the appropriate methods, well-partnered theories, should be coherent with extant literature, make logical connections among arguments. Really, in all, it's what we say it should hang well together to ensure that different paradigmatic assumptions and practices are commiserate with each other. And so that is it for the little mini lecture on trustworthiness. And so I want you to be able to consider when you're writing in your proposal, there's a section on trustworthiness. You can cite anyone you want. There's many people who talk about differing ways of creating trustworthiness or reliability and vigor. However, above all, you just must cite those people and you must talk about it in a way that is qualitatively driven. I think some of you are probably more attracted to the translational method described by Lincoln and Guba, and then there's some of you that are going to be much more open to this transformative idea presented by Tracy. And that's it, and I will see you in class.